Welcome back. This is part 2 of my Stephen King book collection. If you haven't watched my first part, please do. And without further ado, we should just get into it. So the first book is Elevation. It's one of Stephen King's more newer books, and it takes place in this fictional town of Castle Rock. It's a quick read. I've read it. It took me like a day, and it's a good one. It's about a guy who continuously gets lighter in a way, but it's pretty good. It's got a good theme, a good conflict with a couple of characters are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and it touches on the topics of conflict that those characters will face, and I really like it for that. But other than that, it's a short read, something that take just a little bit of time. So if you ever get a chance, I would recommend it. Next up, Everything's Eventual. It's a short story collection known for the story 1408, which is a popular horror movie. It has Samuel Jackson in it. I can't remember the name of the main actor though. But it's a good short story collection even without 1408, because 1408 as a short story is okay. But there's other ones in here like I think it's like where is it? Lunch at the Gotham Cafe. That's a really good intense one. Autopsy Room 4 has a really unique twist. A lot of the short stories are really good, so I'd recommend it. I had a wonderful time reading it. Next up is The Eyes of the Dragon. Now, this is a fantasy book, not a horror novel. So if you're specifically looking for something spooky to read, then this may not be your something up your alley. But if you do like fantasy, I would recommend it. It's a bit childish. Stephen King wanted to make a book that he could read to his kids, so he made this, and I think it accomplishes the job. It's a bit goofy. It has a bit of that child humor that people know, and I had a wonderful time. A lot of times I'd find myself giggling or laughing while reading this book because it's a fun little book. So I'd recommend it if you're interested in something more fun than the classic horror that he's known for. Up next, starting with F, is Firestarter. Now this is a really good book. I really enjoyed it. It's about a girl with pyrokinesis, and the institute that technically created her, wants her back to contain her, and she's trying to escape that. And it's really good. If you like X-Men, like Marvel's X-Men, you'll probably really like this. There's stark similarities in this book and X-Men, and if you like the storyline like X-Men, I think you'll like this story as well. I do have the movie, I just haven't seen it yet. Brenirk has a copy of this book. I'm waiting for her to read it so we can watch it together without her spoiling the book for herself. So I don't know anything about the movie, but I do know I really enjoyed the book. Next up, Fighterfright. This is a short story collection about scary plane stories. Any type of author that's made a short story about planes, it's in here. And Stephen King helped edit it, which means that there's only one short story in here that's actually by Stephen King that has anything to do with planes, and I've read it, and it's okay. I only wanted it for the Stephen King collection, and it's alright. Next up, past midnight. This is a novella collection, and I really enjoyed one of the novellas in here. It's my favorite novella. It's called The Secret Window and the Secret Garden. And they made it into a movie called The Secret Window with Johnny Depp as the main character. And it was really good. It was a really good film. It's a really good novella. I'd recommend it to anyone that's a fan of horror, especially psychological horror, because it really plays on that. There's also other stories like The Langoliers, which was made into a TV series, TV miniseries, and it was laughably bad. But the book, I thought, was fairly okay. There's another story called The Library Policeman, which was very dark, I remember. And there's another one called The Sundog, which I also believe is a Castle Rock story. But if you read it, you'll probably be reminded of a creepypasta from back in the day, because it kind of has some similarities with that. And on to the next book. It's From a Buick 8. Now this is a car story, and as you know from the first part, that Christine is my favorite Stephen King book. Is this always good too? Is this the amazing thing since it's a car and it's Stephen King? And no, this book had potential and it didn't go anywhere. I mean, it's a car that has very mysterious properties, a very mysterious origin. They kind of go through some of the weird things that happen. It's like a recounting. They're telling a story. They're telling you a story. The characters are like, there's so many weird things that have happened with this Buick. And it ends with basically nothing. Just nothing interesting happens once it comes to like the climax of the story, in my opinion. It's just like, You have all these interesting things, all this crazy nonsense, but there's no point. It's just, it's alright. Next up, Full Dark No Stars. This is a novella collection. It has the story 1922 in it, which is now a Netflix Netflix movie. I've read it and I've seen the movie, and they're both pretty good. If you've seen the movie, you've just about seen, read the book without even knowing it, because it's pretty faithful. There's also other novellas, and there's the Fair Extension, which is it's a unique premise. But the really good ones is The Big Driver, which is really, really dark. And there's The Good Marriage, which is really, really interesting. Both of those have been made, Big Driver and Good Marriage have been made into some sort of adaptation of film. But I haven't seen either of them, so I don't know if the film adaptation is any good. But I know the stories were wonderful. Now, here in the G's we have Gerald's Game. This was made into a Netflix film a while ago, and I've seen it and I've read the book. It has a connection to the book Dolores Claiborne, and it's through, I think, The Shining. If you've ever read or seen the movie The Shining and you know what that is, I think there's some element of that in both books. Because there's an eclipse in both books in which the main characters of each almost see into each other's worlds, each other's situations. But either way, the story is about a woman who gets handcuffed to a bed, and it's stuck there. Stephen King, when writing it, actually had apparently he had an idea of how the character would escape, but didn't know if it would work, so he had his son handcuff him to a bed just to see if it would work, and it didn't. Or he had his son handcuffed to a bed. I don't know which. Just to see if it worked, but it didn't, so Stephen King had to come up with a new idea. Just imagine working in on that. Whew. Good book, though. Good movie as well. Next up, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. A short book. It's pretty good. A girl basically gets lost in the forest and just keeps walking and doesn't get found until, people are searching for her, and eventually it does end pretty well. But the thing is just that most people can get angry at this book because it specifically shows a point where the girl's walking through the, forest, and, search parties and helicopters are, around, and they search the area that she was just in. If she had just waited a few more moments, she would have been found, but, Now, who's Tom Gordon? Baseball person. They make it, Stephen King makes it like he's important, but honestly, I don't remember Tom Gordon being all that helpful, because she just listening to the radio when Tom Gordon, whenever he was playing baseball, she listened to it, but I don't know, it's alright. Next up, The Green Mile, a really, really good book. I mean a really good book, and a really good movie with Tom Hanks. I've seen the movie, I've read the book, and they're both really good. But I'd recommend the book just because, even if you've seen the movie, I'd recommend the book because there's more to it. There's more stuff that happens in the book. Just like with just about any book, it's better just because there's more to it. If you wanted more in your story, then you should definitely read it. It's a really good tragedy. It'll pull at your heartstrings. Be ready to feel sad if you read or watch it. I mean, you may not cry, but you'll definitely feel sad. And it accomplishes its goal. It's a tragedy. Next up is Gwendys Button Box, written by Stephen King and another guy named Richard Chismar. I've read this. It's a short little book, and it's pretty interesting. It has some wonderful illustrations in it, I think. Yeah, and it just follows a little girl as she grows up with this mysterious little box full of buttons and levers that have unique properties. I'd give it a read. It's pretty interesting. Now this next book is Gwendy's Magic Feather. It's a sequel, but it's not written by Stephen King. It's written by Richard Chismar. But Stephen King did make a foreword in the book. I haven't read it though, so I don't know if it's any good. But if it's anything like the first one, then I'll definitely enjoy it probably. Now next up, the only H book, Hearts in Atlantis. Now this is a bit complicated to explain because I was confused until I read it. It's a novella collection. But all the novellas kind of follow a similar group of characters. It's all in the same time. It's all in chronological order. It's all in the same timeline. You have it starts with kids and it ends with the elderly. And the situation the 60s and probably early 70s, 60s 70s, because it starts off when they're kids, but when they're adults, it's in the middle of the Vietnam War. And this book has a huge chunk of it just dedicated to the Vietnam War, So if you're interested in something like that, I definitely highly recommend reading this book. I found it an absolute joy to read, especially the first novella when they're all kids, because it has such a, maybe like an it feel to it, but also a new type of meaning. It has a kind of a connection apparently to the Dark Tower, and reading it kind of gives me insight to probably what that'll be about. Either way, a really good book. Now next up is one of Stephen King's newest books, If It Bleeds, a novella collection that I haven't read yet. It's probably good. I don't know anything about it. I haven't read it yet. Anyhow, next up, Insomnia. Did this give me insomnia? Kind of. I mean, I stayed up late at night reading it. It's a big book. It's like 900 pages long. And it takes place in Derry. It follows an old man who has insomnia, but the things that he sees while he's awake in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, the things he witnesses are very interesting. And it's a wonderful story until the end. Ending's fine. I think the very ending is that bittersweet that I love from King. But there's a moment where you come like, good versus bad, it's just like protagonist versus antagonist, and it just gets a little bit stupid. It just comes out of nowhere. It's just a little bit stupid. But overall, really good book. Next up is The Institute, another one of Stephen King's recently newish books. It's a really good one. I really enjoyed it. It follows a bunch of kids that are being taken to an institute for testing. Now that may sound familiar to you if you've seen my mods, and yes, this does technically have a really good influence on the institute that I have in my mods. And if you're interested, I'd say just read the book just to see if you can see some of the connections from this book to the series. But it doesn't have the same explanation. I just took the idea of the institute, I guess, and used parts of it in the mod. Anyhow, next up is It, everyone's favorite. I keep doing this. I'm like, oh crap, they can't see the title. This is a big book. I've got multiple copies of this. It's the first Stephen King book I ever read, and this is just a used copy I got from Amazon because I like the mass market look. Anyhow, it's a really good book. They've made it into movies. They've made it into 2 movies and 1 TV miniseries, and they're okay. But if you want to know anything about it, just read the book. I mean, I know it's big, and that can be intimidating. I totally understand that. I was a bit intimidated too, but I'm telling you, it's worth it. It's a really good story. There's so much more to the book. I mean, in the movie, you just see it as a clown, usually, or maybe something different. But in the book, it turns into tons of other different horror icons, like Frankenstein, or Jaws at one point. I don't know, a teenage werewolf. It makes it more interesting in my opinion. So I'd highly recommend this. It was the first one that I ever read, and reading it gave me the want to read the others, and now I have this huge collection. Next up is Joyland. It's a mystery, a murder mystery, the hard case. Just like the Colorado Kid, but this one actually has an ending. It's alright. I don't remember much about it. I've read it. It's just I forgot most of it. It's a forgettable book. I remember there being there's a romance kind of side plot, and I remember that more than the actual murder mystery, but I remember reading it, and they actually got to revealing who the killer was, and I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot this was a murder mystery. I thought it was just like a kind of romance thing. So if that tells you what you need to know about the book, then now you know. It's alright. Next up is Just After Sunset. That's a short story collection. That's a few good ones, but I don't know if any of them have been made into films of any kind. There's, let me see if I can find the contents. Here we go. Okay. Willa, that's pretty good. It's just letter N. That one's really good. And The Cat from Hell's also really good. There's one called A Very Tight Place. And just to forewarn you, that is a very disgusting little short story. It's not pretty. Anyhow, next up is Stephen King's newest novel to date, Later, which is another hard case crime novel. I haven't read it. Hopefully it's good, but I really don't know. Anyhow, next one, Lizzies Story. Ooh, I haven't read it, but I do know they're making it into a TV show soon, so hopefully that'll be good if I ever get a chance to watch it. Either way, I haven't read it, but I am pretty excited for it, especially now that it's getting an adaptation. So I'll have to get to reading it soon. All right, next up, The Long Walk, a Richard Bachman book, and that means it's really good. A bunch of kids are basically, it's almost like the Hunger Games. Only boys are allowed in this one, though, and they all are basically put on a truck and have to continuously walk 4 miles per hour or more. And there's no ending. It's just whoever's the last man standing is the one who wins. And it's a bit more grim than that, but that's just a basic kind of like what it's about. And it's really good. It's short. It's a quick read. I finished it in like a day, but it's really good. I think most people would enjoy it just because it's an interesting story. I'm very surprised, though, that it has been made into a movie, because I don't think it would cost much to make it. It's not like some like sci-fi epic where there's a lot of needed CGI or anything. I feel like it wouldn't be too difficult, like production-wise. It would be a simple like setting almost. I feel like, but I don't know, I could be wrong. Anyhow, next up is Misery, a classic horror that it's synonymous in horror. It started Kathy Bates' career when the movie came out. James Caan's in it. If you ever watched The Elf, he's in that too. Anyhow, really good book. I think the book's better than the movie. People probably disagree with me on that, but this has a bit more nitty-gritty stuff, and I find it more interesting. When something crazy happens, it gets you. Only thing I don't like is that there are moments where the main character is an author, and he's forced to write a new story, and they show bits of that story in here, and I don't care for that. But the story is about a guy who gets kidnapped, basically kidnapped by a fan, and the fan doesn't like how this author has finished off a series, so she forces him to continue it. And it's a response to the backlash from Eyes of the Dragon. That was a fantasy story that wasn't well received. And people were like, I don't want that. You know what they do want? They want the Dark Tower from last part to be finished. And this was his kind of response to that. So I think that's really interesting. Let's see. Mr. Mercedes is next. This is a really good one. I'd say it's a murder mystery, but you always know who you follow the murderer around in the book a lot. It's almost like a Criminal Minds episode, but really long. Considering what Criminal Minds is. But this is more in depth, and you don't look at psychology. I'm just saying that you follow the villain around, you follow the detective around, and kind of see how their paths intertwine at the climax at the end. And it's really interesting. It's got a good amount of time where it's like everything kind of seems almost calm, and then they just blow up in your face, and it's just like, oh my gosh, something really interesting just happened. Oh my god, it's good at that. I found it really interesting, and it was good enough to get sequels. It's a trilogy, and its sequel is Finders Keepers, which is one of my favorite Stephen King books, which follows a boy who finds a little box and he keeps it. Finders Keepers. But the thing about it is that box contains some pretty valuable things that someone else owns, and it gets a little bit nitty-gritty. But I found it really interesting. I think it was almost like a huge chase that was really intense. You know, I said earlier in my last part that Dreamcatcher had a chase that wasn't at all interesting. This one has a much better build of suspense, and it's a small chase, you know. This book takes its time building up a scene, building up characters for them all to collide together at the end. It's really good at it, and I really like it for it. And the third one that ends the trilogy is End of Watch, which I've read, and it's okay. It's been a while, but I know that it takes a more sci-fi route. You know, it doesn't... The last two were more realistic fiction than, you know, sci-fi or just complete fiction and fantasy. This one kind of changes a bit, and I don't really care for the change that much. This used to be more of a kind of more normal series, but then it kind of just went off tracks. Still a good book, though. It's just, you know, I kind of was disappointed. Anyhow, next book and N is Needful Things. I really like this book. I always have to debate with myself on which one's better, this one or Christine. So right now Christine's winning, but Needful Thing is still amazing. It's the last Castle Rock story in like its timeline. All these Castle Rock stories are apparently all in the same timeline. So strap on for that. Even Cujo makes an appearance in this. Like the story Cujo, like it makes an appearance. It's really cool. I love that fact. But the story is basically a store where you can find anything you want. Literally anything. anything, even if it's something not substantial, like a cure for arthritis. It's not like it'd be a bottle of pills. It's like he'd give you a necklace that would cure it, or just ease it, or something like that. Something that you'd really want. If you wanted to find out, if you wanted to be really good at betting, he'd give you a board game that would tell you the results of each sport ending. So that's always interesting to me, but better yet is that the cost isn't always money, but more likely a deed. You have to do something. And usually it's something that would seem small at first. At first it starts small, but then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and worse until all these little like deeds from all the people in the town just kind of climb up and just boom, it's really good. Read the book, see what happens. It's honestly really interesting. Next up is Night Shift. It's a short story collection, and it's, I think, the first one that Stephen King ever wrote. And it's got a ton of short stories from films and adaptations, and it's got really popular ones. Children of the Corn, that's in here. Maximum Overdrive, that's in here. If you've ever heard of Cat's Eye, that's an anthology film that has short stories from this book. It even has one short story is actually kind of like a inspiration for Stephen King, so he made it and he used it to help write The Stand, which is a book that we'll get into the next part. But this is really good. It even, like, Graveyard Shift, that's in here, and that's a movie. The Mangler, that's in here, and that's a movie. A crappy movie, but still a movie. So if you're looking for something that would have a lot of ties in with something on the film, it's just like, if it's good enough to get a film, it's like, yeah, this is, if that's your ideology, if it's good enough for a film that is good enough for me, then read this. You'll probably really enjoy it. Next up and last one on this shelf is Nightmares and Dreamscapes. This is probably my favorite short story collection, just because, other than Night Shift, this one and Night Shift really tie, because they're both really good. But this one doesn't really have anything like, this doesn't have like any real adaptations like films, but there is a TV show, I believe, called, I have it, I'm pretty sure, called Nightmares and Dreamscapes, where they take a few of these short stories and make them into like episodes. And that's really cool. But there's so many in here with different types of stories. Some of it being like kind of like classic horror, and some of it being like a mystery, some of it being like a psychological horror, some of it just there to gross you out. It's just A to Z, it's all over the place. This is really good. It's really long, it's a very big book, and it's chock full of good stories. So if you're just interested in short stories, I'd highly recommend this one. And that's all for this shelf. I think we got through that with relative time. Either way, thanks for watching, and we'll get to the next shelf on the next part. So watch that. I'll see you next time.